Welcome back, everyone. I'm Amber, the Public Science Events Manager at the Bell Museum, and I'd like to welcome you to our final day of Brain to Brain. It's been an exciting week learning more from brain science researchers at the University of Minnesota. If you're ready to learn more about your own brain, we hope you'll join us at the Bell Museum in our planetarium for our original production, Mysteries of Your Brain. This new animated film is debuting this weekend and will become part of our regular viewing schedule. Please check out our website for more information. Before I introduce our special guest this morning, I'd like to share that we will save some time for questions today. Please post them in the comments on Facebook, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Boston Scientific for their generous support of brain-related programs and activities at the Bell Museum. And now it's time to introduce our guests. Alyssa Plamer and Shreya Lakhan-Pal are both fifth-year PhD students studying developmental and clinical science in the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota. Alyssa's research focuses on how to promote adaptive parenting behaviors and child emotion regulation development in the context of risk. Shreya's research examines the relationships between children's environments, emotions, and brain activity. They are both part of Growing Brains, a student-led outreach group working with community partners to educate young scientists about how brains grow and how we each play a role in our own brain development. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alyssa and Shreya. I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Amber. It's great to be here. We're honored that you've all showed up for this last presentation of the Brain to Brain series. And thank you, Amber and the Bell Museum, for having us. So like Amber said, my name is Shreya, and this is Alyssa.
Hello.
And we're both graduate students at the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, graduate school basically means that we finished high school and we finished college, and then we decided to just keep doing more school. But it also means that we're scientists. So we're not just learning things from textbooks, but we're also doing research that maybe could end up in a textbook one day. And our research interests are about development. So how humans grow and change. That means we study babies, kids, teenagers, and sometimes adults to figure out why we grow the way we do. And Alyssa and I are also both clinical students, which means that we work with kids in a clinical setting as well. So during our question and answer period, feel free to ask us any questions that you have about brains, childhood, or being a scientist. So today we're going to focus on something called neuroplasticity, which is really important for our brains to grow. So let's just start by watching a short video. I'm going to share my screen.
Awesome. So I bet that a lot of you probably know how to ride a bike.
When you turn the handlebar to the left,
and so we're going to watch a video that is a little bit about how riding a bike and how we can maybe change up the way that we ride a bike. So Shreya, what sort of things do you need to do to ride a bike?
You need to pedal, you need to steer, look around, see where you're going.
Exactly. But do you have to actively think about each of those things while you're riding the bike?
I think I've been riding a bike long enough that I kind of pedal automatically, and I kind of just, my body moves automatically.
Okay, well, let's see what happens when you switch it up a bit. This one guy had a funny idea to make a backwards bike and see if it impacted his ability to ride it.
wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Justin Sandlin. First attempt riding the bicycle.
All right. So the faster I go, the better.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these people have been riding a bike their whole lives, and they can't even make it 3 feet. I don't know. Do you think they'll ever be able to learn how to ride a backwards bike? Man, so that video just said it took him 8 months, but we see that he's kind of making it. Although he does look a little bit wobbly. I don't know about you, but I usually ride a bike a little bit quicker. Now, I'm wondering if you think a kid would learn to ride a bike faster or slower. So this is his son, and he made a custom backwards bike for him too. But what you'll notice is he's a little wobbly too, but the video just told us that it only took him 2 weeks to learn how to ride that backwards bike. And the cool thing is at the end of the video, he tried to ride a normal bike again. And you wouldn't think that it would change maybe, but as we can see here, it's actually really challenging for him to stay up on the normal bike after he spent 8 months learning how to ride the bike a different way. And then in just 20 minutes,
I got it. I'm back. Oh, it clicked. Hold on, it clicked. I got it. Okay, there it is. There was the moment. Okay.
and now he can ride a bike again. Now, all of this is pretty strange, but I want you to think about this in terms of neuroplasticity, because this is actually a really good example of it. So if you remember, the kid learned how to ride a bike in just 2 weeks, and that's something that took his dad 8 months to learn how to do. And this isn't only because the dad had formed a habit of riding a regular bike, but because the children's brains are more capable of change. But for now, let's talk a little bit about the brain.
Yes, let's talk about the brain. Thanks, Alyssa. So this is how our brain looks from the side. And different parts of our brain are responsible for different parts of thinking. So one way that we separate the brain is into 4 lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And lots of things that our brain does rely on connections across different parts of the brains or networks. But some of our core tasks are pinpointed to specific lobes, like vision, hearing, touch, and making sense of the world. There we go. So our frontal lobe is in charge of some of the harder parts about being a human, like decision-making, planning ahead, and problem solving. And as it turns out, the cells and connections between different parts of the brain aren't fully developed when we're born. And not only are we still developing certain areas of the brain, but different areas develop at different rates. And believe it or not, some parts of our brain are still developing until we're in our 20s. So in this picture, purple means more developed. So as you can see, by the time we're 5, our vision has pretty much fully developed. That makes sense. We can see pretty well by the time we're toddlers. Our senses and our motion are developed by the time we're 12. So if you or someone you know is still working on motor coordination before you're 12, don't worry. You still have some time. And then you'll see that frontal lobe, the part that helps us with planning, decision-making, and problem solving, that actually doesn't finish developing until we're about 25 years old. So we are actually adults when our brains finish developing. So if you are a teenager or you know a teenager who's still kind of struggling with planning ahead or making good decisions, just remember that that part of the brain is still developing. And it's kind of in your power to practice doing those things. So just like a baby will try and fail and try and fail and keep practicing until they can crawl and walk and run and talk, we are trying and failing and trying and failing and practicing and practicing and practicing until we can become experts in decision making and problem solving when we're in our 20s.
Yeah. So a really cool thing is that your brain is actually made up of a bunch of cells called neurons. And you actually are going to have more pathways or connections between neurons in your brain as a child than you will as an adult. So you're actually born with most of the neurons in your brain. Most of the neurons in your brain are actually there before you're born. But I do want to say that some are still growing throughout your lifetime, and we're still learning a lot about those growth processes. There are some stuff in your brain when you're a child that are there will be there when you're an adult. So you have these things called axons and dendrites and the parts of the cell that connect with each other. And you start out with lots of pathways connecting to various parts in your brain. So if you look at that 6-year picture, you'll see that there's lots of squiggly lines, which is sort of representing how the axons and dendrites in your neurons are all connecting to each other. But then what you notice that might be a little bit more curious is that when you get to 14 years old, there seem to be less of those. So what happens is your brain actually prunes away connections that you're not using. So to strengthen areas that you do use, you have to practice those things over and over and over again. Otherwise, your brain sort of starts pruning away those unnecessary connections. A really cool example of this with kids is when you're little, you can actually hear and pronounce a lot of different sounds, like sounds from different languages that you're not even a part of or from. But as you gain more experience with your specific language, you start to really focus in and get really good at those sorts of sounds and hearing those sorts of sounds, but actually prune away the ability to hear and identify other sorts of sounds. But I do want to say that your brain keeps learning from your experiences by strengthening and weakening those pathways throughout your entire life. So this process happens in adults too. Oh.
I knew that would happen. So what is neuroplasticity? It's what we've been talking about this whole time. It's the brain's ability to change and grow by changing the connections or networks of connections of its cells or neurons. So our brains are the most plastic or have the most neuroplasticity when they're still developing. So if you think about the backwards bike video, maybe that kid's motor areas weren't fully developed yet, but that meant he could learn how to ride a wacky bike really fast. But then think about his dad too. The connections in his brain that fire when he rides a bike are so strong because he's been doing it the same way for so many years that they were really hard to rewire. But with enough practice, he did it too. So adults do also have neuroplasticity. We just have to work a little bit harder. And those connections for riding a regular bike were so hardwired that he was able to pick it up again really fast after just 20 minutes. And that was a strength for him. So what exactly does neuroplasticity give us? It gives us the ability to adapt to different environments. It allows us to take on challenges, even if they seem new and scary. Our brain is ready for the challenge. Alyssa, do you want to show some not actual brains, but have some.
So the really cool thing that we've been able to do with 3D printing technology is that we're able to take pictures of the brain using things called fMRI machines, and then 3D print pictures and live 3D pieces of the brain. And so I'm actually going to show you 3 3D prints of a brain from the same kid across different age groups. So if you look here, this is actually I think it was it's a 4-month-old brain, kiddo. And then his same brain, again, at about 2 years. And you'll notice sort of the size difference here, which I think is really cool. But what you'll notice too is that I have an adult brain here, and this 2-year-old brain isn't quite that different from an adult female brain. And I think that is also pretty cool, showing that like the size of our brain pretty much develops by that time period.
Yeah, so I know we're running out of time, but that's kind of our talk on neuroplasticity and how brains grow. And I think the big idea is that we are growing and changing, and we actually have the power to change how our brains physically grow. And that's pretty cool. So that saying that practice makes perfect, it really makes sense, and it really shows up in our brains.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Shreya and Alyssa. We did have a question and a comment that came in. One of the comments that came in from Pamela was that she mentioned that she teaches this concept to her second graders, and she says, we call it the dip. Does that make sense to either of you? As a person who doesn't study brains, I don't know for sure what she's referring to there. Does that make sense to either of you?
The dip. I don't think I've heard that term before.
I don't think
Pamela,
I
if
have
you're still watching, I would love to know what you mean by that. So feel free to add another comment.
Thank you. Rosario also had a question, and she is wondering if there is a way to redevelop the neural pathways.
Yeah, great question. So our neural pathways are formed when we practice something over and over again, but it doesn't mean that it's there forever. Those connections continue to get strengthened as we keep associating two things together, but we can always change our neural pathways. And when we change our neural pathways, we help change behavior. So kind of like the guy with the backwards bike, he was able to rewire his brain so that he could learn this totally different way of riding a bike. So even though he had these really strong connections, he was able to kind of rewire a little bit so that he could learn something new. And it's the same thing with habits. If you have a habit that maybe you don't like so much, like let's say the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning is you look at your phone. I know that I'm guilty of that sometimes. Every single morning when you associate waking up with looking at your phone, you're strengthening those connections. But every time that you don't do that and you remind yourself, actually, I'm not going to look at my phone today, then you're weakening those connections. And you can kind of undo that by telling yourself to kind of stop that habit.
Yeah, in regards to this idea of neuroplasticity, I'm always interested in the actual things that are happening in the clinical research. Obviously, in the video, we have this idea of retraining your mind around a bike. Can you give us some examples of the type of activities that you're posing to individuals in your clinical research to help and to better understand neuroplasticity?
So not an example from my own personal research, but they actually have done some really interesting work around language development, where they will expose kids to different language sounds at different periods of time in development, and look at how well they're actually obtaining knowledge of those sounds and able to identify those sounds at various points. So what that looks like is sort of these training and practice sessions where kids are coming in and listening to real live speakers speaking, say, Mandarin with a originally English-speaking kid. And then they will, after so many of those training sessions at various age points and in various ways, they'll then test to see how learning functioned.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that any kind of teaching, really, if you think about it, is kind of like a neuroplasticity exercise. And so when we teach kids in a clinical setting, let's say kids have a habit of having really negative thoughts, like sometimes negative thoughts about themselves. One of the things we do in our kind of clinical work is we teach kids how to recognize those thought patterns and try to change them. It's not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of practice, but we can kind of show kids that certain thought patterns are not as helpful, and that we can actually come up with more helpful thoughts. And we just practice that together, and that's kind of neuroplasticity in action, is watching kids be able to change those negative thoughts about themselves or about other things.
Yeah, so the comment that just came in was from Brianna, and Brianna is just saying, so if I'm hearing you correctly, teenagers should practice activities that encourage foresight or executive decision making to help the frontal lobe develop?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yes, that's kind of, well, teenagers and below that as well, but teenagehood, I think, is kind of the prime time for developing that part of the brain. So even though you can keep developing those skills after 25, like, we're not hopeless after 25. When you're a teenager and when you're a young adult, so kind of in the early 20s too, if you're sort of pushing yourself to do activities that, like you said, encourage foresight and planning and decision making, then you're really doing a service to your brain and your brain's development in the long term. And it's also hopefully a little bit of hope in remembering that because our brains are not fully developed at that point, they're still developing. We're going to encounter setbacks. We're going to encounter times where we just don't do it right. And that's okay, because every time we have one of those failures and try again, we're training our brain.
It's pretty clear to me that we have some people who are doing work in the field that are watching this morning. One of the questions that just came in was, have you researched the effects of psilocybin and the neurology and the connection it may have on helping cluster headaches or PTSD? Is that something that either of you have done any work or any research in?
Yeah, was that psilocybin, like mushrooms?
I believe so, yes.
Such a great question. And, there's so much more research that needs to be done on certain drugs that have historically been considered to be just bad all around. And you make a really good point that there is now kind of emerging research that psilocybin, what many of us know as magic mushrooms, can be helpful if it's administered in a clinical context in a certain way. So I don't personally research that, and I don't think anyone in our department does, but they recently opened a center for research on psychedelic drugs and how they relate to these brain processes at UC Berkeley, which is where I went to my undergrad. And I would suggest you look there. And one of the members of that panel is Michael Pollan, who's been very outspoken about this.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Shreya and Alyssa, I want to thank you so much for your time this morning and for helping to answer some of our audience questions about things that they're curious about. Thank you once again for everyone for joining us on this final day of brain science programming. I do also want to extend a special thanks once again to Boston Scientific for helping to support brain-related program at the Bell Museum. We hope that you'll join us soon in person for an immersive planetarium experience and experience that Mysteries of Your Brain show. But once again, thank you, Shreya and Alyssa, for your time this morning. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.